Welcome to our discussion on the impact of COVID-19 and its peace-building implications. This discussion is part of the 2020 Geneva Peace Week. It is co-organized by the International Code of Conduct Association and the Global Interagency Forum. Today, we aim to have a discussion specifically looking at questions of private security providers, peace building, and COVID-19. The background of this discussion is focused on the latest developments and issues that we have seen as a result of the application of COVID-19 measures and the pandemic consequences in high-risk complex environments, and the particular role of private security providers in those contexts. We hope to unpack a number of key issues during the discussions with three excellent panelists, looking in particular at the role and responsibilities of private security providers in many of these environments. Have we seen a change in their responsibilities, in their obligations, and in consequences on their operations as a result of COVID-19 in complex, high-risk environments with a peace-building component? Likewise, have we seen an impact of their activities, the activities of private security companies, on humanitarian operations, on humanitarian activities, on access to beneficiaries? Because in many contexts, we have seen private security providers being labeled as essential workers, taking roles which in the previous times, they were not traditionally given. So have we seen as a result of their actions and their activities, maybe some negative and or positive impact from a humanitarian perspective? In addition, as part of COVID-19, we have seen a greater restriction of the civic space, potential lack of transparency growing in many complex environments, and a range of non-state actors also operating in this context in addition to private security contractors. And those could potentially also have had an impact on humanitarian action, on peace-building efforts in high-risk environments. The aim of this discussion with our three panelists, as I mentioned, is to really talk about some of these issues, grapple with some of the tougher questions, and hopefully at the end of the discussions, identify a few recommendations going forward. Because clearly the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic are going to be felt for a while longer. And we're also likely to see a potential evolution in terms of how private security is carried out in many of these environments and the services that they offer, as well as a potential morphing of the industry at certain levels. To help us during this discussion and actually to provide most of the substance during the discussion, we have three excellent panelists. The first speaker will be Andrew Farquhar, who's the Managing Director in the UK of Garda World, a member company of the International Code of Conduct Association. Beatrice Godefroy, the Europe Director at the Center for Civilians in Conflict, a board member of the International Code of Conduct Association. And Lisa O'Reilly, Executive Director of the Global Interagency Forum, an observer member of the International Code of Conduct Association. So to kickstart the conversations, I'll give the floor to Andrew. And Andrew, with your profile as someone who works in the private security world, of course, I think I'll be looking, and the rest of the panelists will be looking at your reflections on how COVID-19 may have impacted on the profile of activities being carried out by private security providers, on how the industry has had to adapt, and also on some of the issues that you have seen in terms of challenges and opportunities going forward, with a particular focus, of course, on complex environments and areas, high-risk environments where there may be a peace-building component to that particular country. Andrew, welcome to this discussion, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeremy. And I'm going to limit my comments really to those more complex environments, because I think those are the ones which are of particular interest to this discussion. So I'd start by saying the impact on private security providers in these complex environments has been very significant. We have seen a mixed response from the client, but whatever their response has been, the private security provider has had to be quite agile to respond to their requirements. And if one looks at perhaps in the peacemaking scenarios, perhaps diplomatic activity or capacity building activity by friendly states into a complex environment, that is a good example where the activity levels have tried to be continued to develop the capacity building going on and trying to work around COVID-19. However, the effect of COVID-19 and the impact some of the international measures for COVID-19 have meant that some of these diplomatic activities have been reduced. And so there's been a direct reduction because of inability to move around countries safely, securely, and sometimes inside countries itself means that the activity levels have reduced. But if I now just talk about some specifics, looking at the private security providers, we have a job to do, which is providing static security for vulnerable sites where there are high value assets, and we also move people around in a mobile fashion. And if we look at those static sites, many of our tasks have remained unchanged, because be they embassies, be they extractive sites, be they universities, which we look after in some places, or just general warehouses that require security, that task has remained. So we have had to manage our staff through that COVID environment as people come and go into those facilities. And we've had to therefore develop pretty rigorous COVID-19 regimes, all based on World Health Organization, the host nation states legislation, and best practice from our medical governance organization within the company, and indeed within the clients. And it's been a very interesting situation, but the task has not changed. In some areas where we use host nation staff, local national staff to do those tasks, we've had to look at doing them slightly differently, because some of those staff members have been locked down in cities, for example, in Kabul and in Baghdad. And so we've had to replace some of those staff on a temporary basis while maintaining them as employees for their own welfare and their own well-being. We've had to replace them potentially with other country nationals who have been locked down on those sites. And had we retained our local nationals, they would have been unable to go home in the evening and to mix with their communities. So some of those static tasks which are still there have been done in a different way. We have been classed in the majority of countries as essential workers, and that has helped some of our movement, but it has not been as easy as we would like. And the last thing I'd say about static sites is we've operated in COVID-19 bubbles, so the shifts themselves have operated securely to try and limit any impact of any infections of COVID-19. And I would say this, but it's absolutely true, that across the company, those COVID bubbles and our COVID procedures, in conjunction with the client and medical and state authorities, have worked remarkably well. Not perfect, and we have had one fatality, very sadly, but broadly speaking, our staff have done very well. On the mobile side, it's been a much greater effect because people are just not coming into country to visit. They are not moving around the country as they used to, and even going across a city like Baghdad or perhaps Kabul or in Nigeria, Abuja, that has been reduced as well. So we've had to downsize our mobile operations, which in some countries predominantly expatriates, and we've had to send those to their home states. So an interesting static versus mobile balance. But I think the key thing is whether they were static or mobile, all the efforts we've put into putting in place COVID-19 measures. So, for example, we've done awareness training for all of our staff, be they local nationals, third country nationals, or expatriates. We have a weekly company-wide call, which anybody in the company can join. And we had 150, 170 people on that call, chaired by our president and chief ops officer. And he has set the scene and the tone of our counter COVID measures throughout this pandemic, and still does so, although we've reduced them from a weekly to a fortnightly and shortly to a monthly call. We've run webinars on COVID-19 measures, and we've produced standard operating instructions about how our staff should protect themselves and their clients in the COVID-19 way, and it's, as you'd expect, follows international and national COVID guidelines. we've looked very closely at the welfare of our staff, because some of our staff have been unable to move around as commercial civil airliners have stopped flying. And we found that some of our staff have been, in effect, locked in by this inability to fly and this inability to move around within a country. And so we've been doing welfare webinars to them to try and ensure they are safe and our duty of care is discharged. And we've also offered a welfare service through our welfare staff to their families at home, because whilst it might be bad being locked down at your place of work in a different country, it could be absolutely awful if you were at home, the spouse, looking after the children, also locked down because of your own national requirements. So the welfare piece has been significant. And then the equipment. We've managed to procure, front load an awful lot of equipment. We were very fast to do that. And we've also bought many tests, not just the PCR test, but also the triple antibody test. And we've used a combination of PCR and this triple antibody test to try and get an understanding of what's happening. So I think I would just simply say that the biggest impact on our operation has been that loss of freedom of movement, our inability to support capacity building because that's just not happening, and the fact that we have had staff in lockdown in these sites, and that's been quite interesting to manage. But where possible, we have maintained the client's requirement, which is to operate normally, be it an economic event, because it's just a normal commercial client, or if it's diplomatic or a defense client, then we've endeavored to enable those operations. And to a degree, we have managed to do that. So I think, Jamie, if I may, I've finished there, but open to questions from or a discussion, but I'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And quite interesting in terms of just noting in particular the movement part, the limitation in terms of movements for the staff. And that, of course, no doubt will sort of will be piggybacked on by the other panelists in terms of what does that mean in terms of security in context for clients that have to have some level of mobility in these high-risk environments and complex environments. And I think the other component, which is also particularly interesting from your initial remarks, I note is that the question of movement, not so much of the operators themselves, but the distinction between the international and the national staff. And what does that mean? And potentially, could we then see, and this is a major discussion in the humanitarian sector as well, a greater localization of the activities of security providers, where we're going to potentially see less of an international presence and a greater reliance on local presence in terms of security staff and support for the activities, and what that will look like, whether as primes, as subcontractors going forward. I'll pause there, and maybe Beatrice, turn to you from a completely different perspective to that of Andrew's, notably given your work. But it'd be interesting to hear from your perspective in terms of protection of civilians, humanitarian emergencies, as well as conflict, peace building, through your work, the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the presence of non-state private actors, be they private security contractors or others, in these environments. Have you seen the COVID-19 pandemic having any sort of positive, negative consequences based on your experience? Beatrice, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie, and thank you to the ICoCA for putting together this panel at the Geneva Peace Week. So I'll indeed focus my remarks mostly on the pandemic consequences on the protection of civilians. So being on the other side of the fence, right, from after Andrew has presented the perspective of a security actor, I'm going to focus on the impact on civilians as well as on humanitarian activities. And I would say the first element when it comes to how the pandemic has impacted or created potentially new threats to civilians is how COVID-19 has not created new trends in conflicts, but accelerated already trends in conflict dynamics that were already there before. And we see that also in other components. There were trends in the economy, trends in different sectors which have been accelerated, but it's very clear in conflict dynamics and in the way they impact civilians. So two main things I would like to highlight. One, there was before COVID a trend of international powers operating in conflict environments through security force assistance or through remote warfare type of modus operandi. So being a little bit less present and operating via train and equip and assist missions or through security force assistance, which meant basically less presence on the ground from actors who have a capacity to potentially better support the protection of civilians or better support, let's say, broader protection agendas. And at different levels. And what we see with COVID is obviously a number of question marks as to how these actors are going to be present in a number of conflict contexts due to the fact that for economic but also political reasons, they tend to refocus or reprioritize on domestic markets. So we have a question mark on that. We have seen rotations of UN peacekeeping missions. We're seeing rotations of international stabilization missions, which have been delayed due to COVID. So we need to see on the long term what it means, but it can definitely have an impact on civilian populations based in this conflict environment. And the second one, the second trend in conflict dynamics is the increased confrontation between great powers, meaning especially where kinetic operations are happening on the ground, a higher likelihood to see great powers, let's say, intention through proxies. That's exactly what we see in Nagorno-Karabakh these days and that we have seen in other contexts. And this is indeed increasing. And that's typically the type of environment, as we see again, Libya, Nagorno-Karabakh and elsewhere, where we have private military actors being present, mercenaries, non-Saddam groups, also local forces, a variety of actors being present in a context where they have different capabilities, different interests, different understanding and vision at the protection of civilians. And so we see civilians in this environment exposed to this variety of actors with limited security forces having a mandate to actually protect them. So I think that's an important acceleration of a trend that is not new again, but that's impacting the protection of civilians in these COVID times. The second one, and I would like to get to a more granular level, is how the vulnerabilities of civilian populations have been evolving. I think it's too early to conclude on strong trends because we have seen differences across countries. In some countries, we were very worried at the beginning, and at the end of the day, let's say the impacts have been less so present until now, but in other contexts, the impacts of COVID have been huge. So we need to see over time what that means, and especially as we are going through the second wave. Looking at the first wave, though, in contexts like Iraq, Nigeria, Afghanistan, what my colleagues and myself have observed is the impact of the health crisis on societies and population, impacting livelihood, violence against women and girls, conflict dynamics, social relations. So all of this put together, and I mean, for instance, if you're looking at conflict dynamics, we've seen, for instance, in the northeast of Nigeria, worsening grievances on governance, trust deficits between population and security actors, anger at military agencies. All of this is an environment that I imagine impacts also the broader security sector and the relationship between the security sector and civilian populations. This is happening indeed in contexts where for decades violence was very present and had reduced access to health care. So we have a mix of factors where populations, and especially the most vulnerable populations like elderly, populations with disabilities, again, women, boys and girls, and populations with discriminations are even more exposed as a result of COVID and have reduced access to health care. Or to humanitarian assistance as a whole. And just an example of how things intersect, we've had very interesting information coming from Nigeria. For instance, in Monguno, we've had this tension between security agents and the National Union road transportation workers. transportation workers were in charge of conveying supplies between Monguno and the outside of the city, and with after security tensions with security agents who were in charge of enforcing the movement restrictions, they had to stop this. So in addition to the tension between the union and the security agents, the populations of Monguno faced an increase of the prices as a result of the decrease of the supplies coming in the area. So it's getting into this granular level, but here we see how the vulnerabilities of the population, the tension on the livelihood, as well as the tension between local security actors and workers actually impact the protection of civilians. And then my last point is about the humanitarian sector. As you were saying earlier, Jamie, very rightly so, the COVID-19 is and will be a major moment for reshaping the humanitarian sector. Their modus operandi, and especially these big international humanitarian agencies relying heavily on supplies from abroad and on rotation of expatriates, have been challenged very much by what's happening right now. Let's see on the long term, they have been also very good at adapting. So again, let's see on the long term how that looks like. But there's definitely a lot of conversation on horizontality between North and South. What's the role of the actors in the North, the headquarters, versus the role of their sort of local offices in the South, how to work better with partners, how to work better with local staffs, also how to better increase the engagement with local communities. We have seen in some contexts that aid workers or UN workers have been viewed as COVID carriers, and therefore has been put in situations of tensions with local population. I would say at CIVIC we were very lucky. Our model is actually to base our presence on the ground with resident staff. So I'm a resident staff in Europe as Europe director. My team in Ukraine is fully composed of Ukrainian staff, the same in Nigeria, etc. So with this type of model, we've had the chance to be as present as possible on the ground, and the continuity of operations and programs have been ensured. So I'll stop here. Again, I think what comes out for me at this stage is a trend of increase and accumulation of vulnerabilities for local populations. On the other hand, a little bit too early to say whether other trends, especially in a variety of countries, are going to impact on the longer term the populations, but definitely an area to monitor for an organization like mine looking at the protection of civilians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. And I think there's 2 or 3 key points, and I might rebound on some of these with Andrew as well later on, about the vulnerabilities and the tensions that we're seeing. But also, I think the component that you mentioned at the very beginning, the proxy nature of warfare to some extent, of the limited direct international presence, both in terms of the warring factions, but also we mentioned here the sort of peacekeeping component that's on the other side, trying to sort of bring a certain level of protection of civilians to the fore in these complex environments, and the struggles that they're going to have as the so-called security apparatus for instance, IDPs in some regions and so on. I'll pause there and maybe turn to Lisa, because interesting enough, because we've seen the humanitarian perspective in terms of the impact on civilians in these environments. We've seen a security perspective in terms of private security companies, not to be confused with military contractors and mercenaries, for the record, operating and the impact on their activities in certain high-risk environments. Humanitarian agencies tend to be the bridge between the two sort of communities in terms of the beneficiaries, those in need and operating in those high-risk environments. But we're also seeing a greater reliance also by humanitarian agencies on security contractors for their own security in many of these environments, for better or for worse. How have you, from your perspective as someone who works with humanitarian agencies on the security dynamics for humanitarian agencies, how have you, Lisa, seen sort of the evolution of the pandemic in these high-risk environments? Has there been a dramatic shift in terms of the vulnerabilities and security from the perspective of humanitarian agencies that you work with? Are we seeing question marks with regards to the role of security providers and the dropping in standards? There's a whole bunch of questions, but I'll stop there and maybe allow you first to give me your thoughts on it. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jamie. And thank you to Beatrice and Andrew, because you sort of set the scene, and I feel as if, as Jamie says, I have a foot in each of the two. And what Beatrice was saying around the change in humanitarian action that's had to take place because of COVID has also had an impact on how we are using the services of private security providers. What's quite interesting is, as Andrew was saying, the static work has not changed, particularly so far. I think at the beginning of the COVID outbreak, we were really much more concerned that there might be greater threats against internationals because of COVID being seen to be carriers, and so targeted attacks, which, while there have been incidents, it's not been as widespread as we feared it might be. And where there were a lot of, I think, contingency planning done at the beginning for expectations of large amounts of change, it didn't happen rapidly. And I think what we're thinking is these changes are going to happen, but it's going to be much more slowly than we originally anticipated. And when I say things like that, Beatrice was talking a lot about the impact on civilians and livelihoods, and I think that's one area of concern for us is when the global economic impact of COVID is felt, both in terms of funds available to support humanitarian action, but also the economic impact in the country. We expect there will be greater civil unrest. We expect that humanitarians are often seen as wealthy, so there may be an increase in crime, but also the goods that we are distributing, there will also be a greater value on that. So I think there are concerns that as this pandemic continues to run, that the threats and the threat environment will change. And I think we've also seen, again, as mentioned by Beatrice, you know, the increased action of non-state armed actors. Those they seem to be using the opportunity that the pandemic has created. And that links to another concern of mine. You were talking about the fact that often private security providers have been identified as essential workers. That blurring of lines, and we've seen over a number of years some of the private security providers trying to present themselves as humanitarian actors, which causes a lot of problems for humanitarian actors where people don't necessarily understand who we are. And we see a blurring of lines, and we're seeing more and more where aid workers are considered to be legitimate targets by people who are wanting to take sort of political as well as local action. So to me, there is a concern of any sort of further blurring of those lines. I think the other impact from COVID, which again, I think links to what Andrew was saying around the lack of mobility, what we are seeing is because the more strategic level security staff within organizations, so the global and the regional staff, because their travel is restricted, there's going to be a growing reliance, I think, on the analytical skills and the analytical products that private security providers are providing, as well as sort of greater roles for coordination bodies and better sharing of information between organizations. And we're going to have to get better at doing that because we don't have that same access into the context for us to sort of gather firsthand context and analytical information. So I think that's definitely where we are seeing a change in the use of some of the products of private security providers. And I think finally is, you know, you talked about the national versus international and the localization. And this is something that we're watching closely because it's very interesting that the rhetoric around localization is strong. The desire, the opportunity that we now have to increase that use of local actors and local providers of humanitarian assistance. But unfortunately, the funding isn't following it. So in response to COVID, a lot of the emergency funding that's been made available has been centralized again through the big INGOs, the UN. So that there's currently a mismatch between the sort of the localization agenda, what's being said and what's actually being done. So there is an opportunity here for us to work together in terms of, you talked about standards, and I think this is a link that we need to look at as how do we maintain those standards as this increased use of national staff, both within the aid agencies and the private security providers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Quite a few points there. And nice to see sort of the bridging between Beatrice and Andrew on a couple of components. What I might do here is pick up on a point that you made. I mean, we've spoken about the national staff and the localization, but I think there's a point you made about the blurring of lines and some of the comments. And I see Andrew's hand coming up. Don't worry, Andrew, I will come to you on this one. And also it's for Beatrice as well, I think. There's different levels of blurring that I'm looking at here. I think the first blurring is the one which we've just mentioned as part of this discussion. If security providers are being seen as essential workers, then could they be seen as the long arms of the authorities that are exacerbating potential tensions and worsening the vulnerabilities that Beatrice alluded to in her, well, actually didn't allude to, but was very clear about in her initial comments. And then how do the security providers keep that level of independence and objectivity as part of their operations? And then the second level of blurring, this is both for Andrew and Beatrice, would be, if we go back to that proxy discussion, there is this blurring, of course, between the so-called civilian combatants, but what about the blurring along the spectrum in terms of the non-state providers, from the mercenary to the military to the quasi-militias to the security providers? And that is a blurring that we're seeing quite often in sort of the media, but also in these environments where one uniform looks like another uniform. How do we overcome that? So maybe, Andrew, as you sort of waved, I'll put that to you first in 1 or 2 minutes, and then likewise, Beatrice, if you could tackle that part too. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks to Beatrice and Lisa as well for all the points, because I think they're all interlinked clearly. The first thing I'd say is that private security providers are not state actors, and we all know they're not state actors. So some of the comments I think that were made by Beatrice about perhaps the overzealous state controlling movement because of COVID-19, that is a state issue. And where the private security provider is focusing is on the client's requirement. So we are working with clients, and that might be an NGO. We work for lots of charities and some NGOs. And so we don't see it as a blurring, and we would never say that we are humanitarian workers, absolutely. But what we would say is we enable humanitarian operators to operate in difficult environments. And that's why there are private security providers supporting NGOs. And of course, it's because they have valuable assets. They're moving humanitarian aid around. And so there is a concern about, as Lisa talked about, greater chance of attacks against the individuals. There's the concern about the spreading of COVID, which I think we've all talked about, from non-nationals. So I would just say that it's really important that we're clear that the private security provider is not a state actor, nor a humanitarian worker, but we support the aims of the humanitarian agencies by our enablement. So that's the first thing I'd say. And on localization, the one thing that private security providers are, I would argue, pretty good at is localization. So, for example, in Kabul, we employ just over 5,000 people. 92% of those are Afghans. In Iraq, 95% of our 4,500 workforce are Iraqis. So we're working very hard at that. But in the COVID-19, that's almost backfired on us, because certain areas of Kabul were locked down by district, and that denied our local staff the ability to travel, which is why we had to find replacements for them. Now, that's not because we didn't want to stay local, absolutely we did, but because of state implemented lockdowns, we were unable to do so. So maintain our task for the client, we had to find additional staff. And I think that I would just mention is really important, because localization is the way it should be. The state should have its own nationals in its own security forces and police forces, and arguably it should then have many of its local nationals employed doing the less state-orientated security, perhaps of warehouses, perhaps of valuable assets. And if I could just quickly go on that comment about analytical versus presence. I mean, we believe that all security providers should have an in-depth analytical capability, because if you don't understand the culture, if you don't understand the way people operate in all these countries, how their lifestyle and how their economy works, how can you operate in a meaningful way in those countries? And so we put a tremendous amount of effort in our, what we call our risk assessment managers and our information analysts to try and give us the edge. So I absolutely agree that if you can't get there, and even when you get there, you need all of that support. And if you're trying to support your staff at reach, being you can't physically get there, pushing information at them is really, really important. And I think most private security providers would absolutely endorse what I said and support that. And then
I'll pause you here, Andrew, maybe move over to Beatrice very quickly, because I'm bearing in mind time's flying past. Beatrice, on the blurring piece, and we know it's an age-old debate, so the military, mercenary, security piece, but you've spoken about the proxy nature of warfare, of the presence of non-state actors. Do you see this blurring being exacerbated by COVID-19, or simply it's a trend which is with us and will stay with us for years to come?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm happy to pass the ball then back to Andrew if you had some one last point to mention. I would say I'm not really sure about the blurring. As you were mentioning, a little bit like Andrew, I'm not sure we're in the blurring of the lines that's been accelerated by COVID, but definitely the proxy nature, of course, yes. And so to the 2 points that you mentioned, the one, the sort of situation where security agents are being working alongside the authorities and then sort of assimilated to authorities by populations. Yes, of course, in this type of situation, you have potentially an issue of perception, because I don't see local populations doing, it's the same actually when you have a variety of militaries or protection forces engaging in conflict environments, securing humanitarian convoys, etc. I don't see local population in a very complex environment making the difference or operating the difference between all the different sort of security actors. So there's definitely an issue there. And in conflict environments where, and especially in regions or areas where you had previous tensions between the government and the local populations, indeed, there is a risk of increased tension and a risk for the population, but also for the security agents themselves. So there's a question of sort of force protection here, so to say, to use the military language. Then the second question of working through proxies, including mercenaries, militias, etc. It's really a tough one, Jamie, and I don't think I'm going to be able to unpack this and provide solutions here. This trend is accelerated, as I was mentioning, and we're seeing it in the news every day. This conversation is complicated because with proxies, it all depends on who is the assisting nation or who has the assisting power. Whoever are the international powers or assisting nations backing those proxies, they need to ensure that there is transparency and accountability on incidents caused by these forces. So these incidents need to be reported and investigated into. So that's one very important first point. And the second one is there's been long-lasting conversations on international regulations, including on the use of mercenaries. These conversations need to resume and to get and to be concluded because of the very fast trend of acceleration of the presence of these groups on the ground in very exposed environments where civilians are targeted. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think this is, sometimes it's difficult to actually make the connection between when we proxy warfare issues and private security contracting. But I think it comes back to that key question in terms of perception. And also if we're seeing nationals of the so-called international powers involved in proxy warfare operating alongside security providers, and then what that means for the security provider in terms of their own perception and their own role in peace building efforts. Maybe Andrew, I'll give you the floor back for those that third point, and then I'll ask a question about duty of care to Lisa.
Okay, the third care is access to healthcare. And one of the things that we've found has been a challenge is that because national healthcare facilities are sometimes weak in complex environments, they're limited anyway, and perhaps not as sophisticated as we might wish. So when you find a client, or indeed members of your local staff who have succumbed to COVID-19, getting them the adequate, if you like, medical duty of care and making sure their health is sustained as best possible has been one of our top priorities. The safety of our staff, along with the safety of our client, has been absolutely the top priority. And so we internally do have an element of a medical capability, but what we've worked very closely with is other companies, other providers, be it a national provider or a company as operate quite often in places like Kabul and Iraq, to deliver to us a certain percentage of their COVID-19 and respiratory capability. Mm-hmm. And that's worked quite well, but it has been a challenge, as you can imagine, to try and get people there. And then to try and repatriate a casualty who is post the COVID piece, but needs to go back to his host nation, has been quite challenging as well, because that's meant a medevac aircraft, which is absolutely fine, but getting access for that aircraft into some countries, particularly in Asia, where they've locked down some of their borders, has been a real challenge. So that access to medical care and able to evacuate into their host nation has been one of our issues. But again, it's worked quite well, but it has been hard work and a major priority for us. Thank you.
Lisa, if I may, turning to you, we spoke a little bit about the question of duty of care. And duty of care has been something which has been coming up quite regularly at the sort of governmental levels, but also within humanitarian agencies and broader discussions, which has already been touched upon by Andrew from a security provider perspective. Can you unpack that as well in terms of the sort of supply chain, the humanitarian agencies component with regard to, what is duty of care actually all about? Where does responsibility lie? And at what point do we look at a security company as well for its duty of care with its clients?
Thank you. It's an interesting question around duty of care, and we've been unpacking this for the last few years within the humanitarian sector. And there's often the difference between what's the legal duty of care and what's the moral duty of care. And I think this is something that's cropped up in a number of places where they are using sort of private security providers for guarding services and things like that. So obviously the legal duty of care for those staff belongs with the employer of those staff. But as a humanitarian agency that it often uses acceptance within the community as a key component of their security strategy, those guards are often the interface between the organisation and the community and the people that they're working with. So they have to be, they have to know who they are guarding, and they have to be aware if people ask questions. So I think there is also a responsibility within the aid agency who is using those guarding services to also take care of them, so they understand and they recognise what a key component of the overall security strategy of their organisation is. And I know ICoCA is working very hard on trying to raise standards generally of staff care within the members of ICoCA and the private security providers, but that isn't always the case at a national level. So I think that that making staff feel that they're looked after is important on both sides. And then looking at it from the other side is, the duty of care towards the clients of the private security providers. This is something that we've discussed amongst our members a few times, and I'm not sure we've ever come to a sort of a complete conclusion, is when you're buying services, what level of responsibility does the provider of the services have towards the staff that it's looking after? And I think particularly when you start talking about perhaps armed guarding services and the responsibilities, and I think sometimes that's something where perhaps as aid agencies we're not as good at doing the due diligence on the private security providers that we should be doing before we employ them. So there is a full understanding of where exactly duty of care lies. And I think just also on the duty of care action, I think Andrew and Beatrice mentioned this from different ways, is one of the things that we have seen as a result of COVID is an increase in domestic violence. So where is the responsibility for the staff, whether they are the receivers of domestic violence or whether it's the staff member is the person who may be perpetrating that? How do we take care of that change and the people that we're working with? And I know Andrew mentioned that you know, a large proportion of the staff within the private security providers, but also the humanitarian agencies, are national staff. But a lot of the management and the independent oversight has been by those international staff who are often not there now. So I think COVID has certainly thrown up some challenges around duty of care, and particularly looking outside just the immediate staff member, but the impact on the community and the families as well.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm bearing in mind the time that we have, so maybe as a part of a wrap-up, but also the last sort of question to the panelists, if I may, and also as a wrap-up, if you wish, as part of that, or a response to something that may have been said from the other panelists. The question very much linked to technology. How do you see technology taking over or effectively being a tool to better manage situations like the COVID-19 pandemic, and what that looks like in terms of security and access to vulnerable populations and the likes? Are we going to see an evolution in terms of how technology is being used, and what could be the pitfalls in greater technology use in peace building efforts? Very easy question to sort of capture in a few minutes. I don't know, maybe I'll go to Beatrice first.
Yeah, very quickly. It's a big question. So of course, technology is a big component also of how war is being waged and what type of threats are civilians are exposed to. But the one thing I would mention is technology and how it is used for hybrid tactics, so non-kinetic confrontations. And so it's about, you know, the manipulation of information, cyber attacks, etc. And so there we see that technology is being used as a way to target populations below the threshold of international humanitarian, so below the threshold of armed conflict, basically. And population are in this type of situations a target, but also an agent, potentially a perpetrator of a sort of non-kinetic violence or non-kinetic actions. So, and this is particularly relevant in areas of outbreaks and pandemics, because of we mentioned a lot the tension, the stress that the population is facing, and all of us actually are facing in this situation of uncertainty and increased vulnerability in these times of COVID. And so we can expect that powers which are right now in this logic of confrontation, be it great powers or be it armed non-state actors or criminal organizations, etc., will use this technology as a way to further destabilize local populations and create tensions. And this definitely can have an impact on the working environment of the security sector.
Yeah, definitely. Exactly. So then the impact of technology in a negative sense in terms of how the population also perceives security actors will be looked at. Lisa, any sort of comments quickly on the sort of question of technology? I note from my screen that we seem to have lost Andrew for a bit, but that's the nature of doing things online these days, but we'll keep the discussion going nonetheless for the last couple of minutes.
I think from a technology perspective, I'm going to go to the opposite end of what Beatrice was talking about. In terms of what we've seen is this greater reliance on Zoom and the webinars is changing the relationship between the international and the local. And I think it's again, there's an opportunity for us to be able to be closer. And it was an interesting comment made around, you know, when you're sitting in your front room or bedroom and you're talking to your national staff who is also in their bedroom, it's equalized. And there may be an opportunity also for security and how we engage better and reduce some of the the hierarchical components of this.
Perfect. I'll take note of that. So this brings us to the end of this particular discussion. It's an ongoing discussion, so we'll continue it in many ways. And I think what I'll simply try and summarize in 10 seconds, questions of localization, lack of mobility, greater tensions and vulnerabilities, funding issues, and perception for security providers in terms of their own activities and operations are just some of the topics that we need to dig in a bit deeper going forward. I'll say thanks to the panelists, Lisa and Beatrice, who are still with us. Andrew will no doubt receive a virtual thanks, and we'll end the discussion here and wish you all a good day. Thank you.